And now I get the pleasure of introducing our president and CEO, Mr. Nick Penizzato. He's going to give us a little information on how to kill turkeys out of state. Or no, I mean, he's going to give us some information on an organizational update. Nick is a Pennsylvania guy like me, but he got lucky. Our season doesn't start yet, but he got to head out of season and have a little fun. Maybe he'll share a little of that as well. But Nick, let us know what's been going on here at NDA for the last month.
Sure. Yeah, now I feel like I have to tell a bit of a turkey story, so maybe we'll start with that. I will say I appreciate everybody being here, and just to show you how important beer and deer is to me, I haven't even unpacked my truck yet. I literally pulled in, ran up here, and logged in just in time after my 5-hour drive. But yes, I was hunting in Delaware with some friends there, and had the pleasure of calling in a nice long beard for the governor of Delaware a couple of days ago. So if you want to talk about some pressure, that was pressure. And then when I had to call for myself, I have come home empty-handed. So there you have it. Anyway, it was way more important that he get a bird, I think, than me. So anyway, it's good to hear people talking about turkey and getting out in the woods. And I got to tell you, we did an awful lot of deer scouting as well. It's just a great time to see things before it greens up, and even picked up an antler shed. So again, good to see everybody. Let me give you a quick organizational update, and then we're gonna be talking some fire here, which I think is a subject that a lot of people were interested in learning more about. So we're hosting our first branch quarterly policy update for branch leaders. That's tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock Eastern time. So if you're a branch leader, check that out. If you hear us talking about branches and you're not part of a branch, just a reminder to look into that. There's opportunities beyond just being a member of NDA. And frankly, if you're not a member of NDA yet, we'd like you to do that too. So there are a lot more opportunities for you to get involved. So that's 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. We'll also be providing testimony to the Michigan House of Natural Resources Committee on Thursday regarding the need for widespread low-cost CWD testing and addressing some other CWD concerns. Nobody enjoys talking about chronic wasting disease. I hate talking about it, but the reality is we have to. We have a responsibility, and we need to make it as easy for people to deal with that disease as we can. So the good work going on in Michigan. New York recently passed the youth deer hunting pilot program. It's a win. It's a small win, although it doesn't expand youth hunting opportunities to the extent that we really advocated for. But a lot of times you have to take these things brick by brick, and that's what we're doing there. Ultimately, the counties in New York will have to opt in as to whether or not this is something they want to participate in. So continue to stay tuned on this. We want to make it easy for youth to be able to hunt in New York. They're lagging behind the rest of the country, frankly. Public comments currently open for Wisconsin's 2021 seasons and structures. See our website for details, deerassociation.com. And this is just a reminder that many states, frankly, most states, this is the time of year they're setting seasons and bag limits and going through potential new regs. So pay attention to our website, sign up for our weekly newsletter. It comes out every Thursday morning, and you can participate in the policy that's happening right in your backyard. On the R3 front, recruiting new hunters, we've established 2 new web addresses for you to check out: deerassociation.com/new hunter. That is a landing page with registration for new hunters, offering our free and paid new hunter resources. I'm going to assume that most people that are watching this tonight are probably already pretty avid hunters. And I'll just tell you, you wouldn't believe the number of emails we get on a regular basis from people who want to know how to hunt. And that's exciting stuff. And we're trying to be a great resource for them. The other website is deerassociation.com/mentor. And it's a mentor sign-up page with some mentor resources. So maybe you want to help somebody become a new hunter. It's often we get emails and people say, hey, I live in eastern Minnesota. I'm looking for a mentor, someone to show me how to deer hunt. You might be able to help that person out, and we'd certainly appreciate it. A couple other things here. Our online discounts that we were offering during COVID, which I'm not trying to say COVID's over, but for our Deer Steward 1 and our Deer Steward modules, those discounts have been in place since March of last year. This is just a note to say that we're going to be releasing those discounts and going back to our regular pricing. Approximately June 1st, that's going to happen. So this would be a good time to jump on there now. If you were thinking about jumping into one of those, if you're on the fence, now would be a good time to sign up before we go back to our regular prices. Kip and Matt were recently on the Mississippi State University Deer Lab Final Forage video series. This was a fun play on the Final Four in the basketball tournament. So be sure to check that out if you haven't already. Branch portal, we talked about that a lot last time. That continues to have branch resources loaded. It's one of those things that's just going to continue to get better and better over time. Make sure you check that out. And finally, I'll end with this new branch, a new branch, part of the group here, part of the herd, if you will. I want to welcome the Granville County branch, which is near Oxford, North Carolina. Early on, I talked about if you're not already a part of a branch, you want to become more active as a member, you want to start a new branch, reach out, we'll get you the resources and get you started. A lot of positive momentum, exciting times here at the National Deer Association. So with that, flip it back over to you guys, and we're going to talk about some fire. Good to see everybody.
Thanks, Nick. So this is my opportunity to introduce our speaker. He mentioned as one of the bullet items there, the final Forage series. So Kip and I were guests on that, and we've turned the tables on one of the panelists or hosts of that, Marcus Lashley. Dr. Lashley actually invited us to be on there. So back at you, Marcus. Now we get to have you on our show. Marcus received his bachelor's degree in forestry with an emphasis in wildlife from Mississippi State, a master's in wildlife and fisheries from University of Tennessee, and his doctoral degree from North Carolina State University. He joined the Wildlife Ecology and Conservation Department at University of Florida in fall of 2019, where he's the assistant professor there. And his research interests line in with disturbance ecology and how plant community structure influences interactions between competitors and predator-prey dynamics. And obviously tonight we have him here talking about fire and how it's related to deer and deer management. And I'm frankly a little surprised at the flame lengths in the photo behind you. It was a little bit hotter, but that's okay, Marcus. The floor is yours. Please entertain us. We're real interested in this. So go ahead and share your screen and bring your presentation up.
Can y'all see it okay? Good?
Looks good to me.
Okay.
Good, Marcus.
Well, yeah, thanks guys for having me. I'm really stoked to be here. I love talking about fire, and I love this webinar series. I've been enjoying it. I really appreciate what you guys are doing, and I'm humbled, honestly, to be a part of it after seeing some of the stuff that y'all have had. It's been really awesome to watch. And I also know that in this crowd, because of some of the great outreach efforts and the great information available to everybody that's active with NDA, a lot of you already know a lot about fire and a lot about habitat management for deer. And I realized that, and thinking, looking at a couple back, my mentor, Craig Harper, did one on forest stand improvement. He talked a lot about fire, and he talked about some of the things I thought about talking about. But I realized that, you're already pretty well versed in how fire can benefit things. You already know that getting sunlight to the ground and using fire to augment the effects of sunlight can produce some really awesome foraging opportunities and bedding opportunities for deer. And that got me thinking, what should I focus on to really deliver something to you that you haven't been thinking about, or maybe helps you think about how you can use fire a little better. So that's what I decided I would focus on: some barriers to fire use that I come into contact with commonly, and also some common misperceptions and how they relate to some really cool things that I've been doing in the lab to address those things. So the first thing I wanted to do, and I want to remind everybody that this is live, so you're welcome to join in the chat. But how many of you think this is a good deer right here in the center? A lot of people, right? That's a pretty good deer pretty much anywhere he's standing, right? How many of you think that that deer is being supplemented by supplemental feeding? A couple. What about it has access to really high quality summer food plots? Anybody? Maybe a few? I'm introducing you to this deer. I didn't name it, but this individual standing where it's at with this very photograph really transformed the way that I thought about deer management and habitat management, what is possible, what is needed, and what isn't. All of those things were transformed when I saw this image specifically. So I can go on and tell you this deer has no access to supplemental feed. It's on a hunted population on Fort Bragg military installation. And it is standing at least 3 miles from the nearest feeder, but I'm guessing based on some of the properties and looking at it from an aerial, it's got to be at least 4 miles from a supplemental feeder. In the landscape that it's in, virtually none of it is in early succession, like forest openings, and very little of it is in summer food plots. And I actually did a diet study on the same area where we reconstructed the deer diet, and those things don't really show up in their diet, neither of them, as a whole in the population. So I started thinking, man, that shouldn't even be possible. How are we producing that deer? So I know what a lot of you are probably thinking, or some of you at least, you're probably thinking, oh man, I don't know that much about Fort Bragg, but it's got to be in a really high quality soil region. So I wanted to show you this. Notice I've got it circled right here where that occurs, and it's red. There's not much in the United States that's in red, but that corresponds to a 0. A 0 on a scale from 0 to 19 in soil productivity. We're literally talking about a deer standing in 15-foot deep sand in the poorest soil region in the entire range of whitetail deer. And we're still producing deer like that. And I know what you're thinking, well, that one fell out of the truck, right? Somebody was toting it over to the other high fence and he fell out, or he got out from under the fence or something like that. And I'll tell you, that's a reasonable hypothesis, but you may not have even noticed this guy behind him. He's not bad either. He's kind of getting dwarfed by this guy in front, but he's not anything to be ashamed of. And these things are all over this place, right? We're talking about the poorest soil region. Notice we've got a nice little buck in the back too that's a little younger, but that's a pretty respectable deer. This one is nothing to shake a stick at. I mean, I would love to see that on my camera. I don't know about y'all. None of these deer have access to any supplementation at all. They have some openings. They're pretty small, but it's less than 1% of the landscape. What they do have access to is a whole bunch of ground that looks like what you're looking at right here. So we have this flyover and this really open canopy. A lot of sunlight is getting to the ground, and virtually every deer at any time of the year, wherever it is standing, it has access to ground that has been burned in the last few months. So think about what I just said. I'm not talking about it has access to a recently burned area or one that was burned 2 years ago. I'm talking about literally within the last few months at any time of the year. And it's because they're so aggressive with the fire regime here. Literally, the landscape is a fire mosaic with this going on. And that's going to lead me into something we're going to talk about here in a minute that I think is a real barrier. But even in this landscape, we have plants responding to this situation like this pokeweed right here. A lot of you probably know that that's a high quality forage. Obviously, deer have responded to this plant. So just because this plant is in poor soil quality, the poorest of quality, do you think that it's also poor forage quality? I mean, it's pokeweed, right? I happen to know what the quality of pokeweed is there, and it commonly exceeds 30% crude protein. Notice that there's a whole bunch of other good stuff. If you haven't watched Final Forage, go take a look at that. Poison ivy did surprisingly well. I think it was kind of a sleeper for people. It is all over the place there, and deer are hammering it. And there's a lot of sunlight, frequent fire happening, and deer are responding to that. So another thing that you might be familiar with from, you may have heard of mineral stumps. The original data that I was collecting to come up with that idea came from this place. And what you're looking at right here, we're collecting, I've got my awesome overalls on. It was Overall Friday. Chitwood left his at home. But we're collecting dogwood resprouts right here. This dogwood got top killed by fire. They're all resprouting. Notice that I can't even get the soil. It's so sandy and poor that I can't even get it to stay in the soil probe. All right, we're trying to collect soil samples next to it. This thing was still exceeding 20% crude protein well late into the season. You know, when most of the antlers had already peaked, we still have that in high abundance across the landscape. Pretty incredible considering that. So if you don't get anything else out of this presentation other than what I just told you, all the way up till now, think about this real hard. We can't pour a lot of that stuff out of a sack, right? But we can sure pour habitat out of a drip torch. So let's think about that. Let's unpack that some more. So one of the biggest barriers, I think, out of my experience working with people in a bunch of different areas is our perception of what the burn window is. So I thought I'm going to focus on the Southeast because that's where we have really good data, but a lot of these things apply to you wherever you're at, and you might have to shift the windows a little bit, but just bear in mind with me, I want you to realize at the landscape scale what's happening to our burn window. So this study took 30 years of data based on weather conditions and whether or not you could pull a permit on a given day, and looked at it on average, and I've kind of collated that into something that's really easy to visualize. This is the number of days on average per year you would get in a given month that you can pull a burn permit, all right? Notice our traditional fire window in this part of the year, you have about 10 days out, you know, 1/3 of the days in any given month. The most underutilized portion of the burn window is actually in the fall over here. We're going to talk about this more. We get a lot of good burn days over there, but how many of you are actually burning then? I'm guessing probably not that many, all right? If we add all of those together, it's about 90 days per year on average based on the last 30 years of data that we would get. So let's think about some of the barriers to burning. One that I hear really commonly is the nesting window. So we don't want to burn during turkey nesting, and we can talk about that. I'm happy to answer questions about this coming up in the chat session, but for now, let's just assume that you're one of these people that doesn't want to burn during turkey nesting. That reduces you down to about 70 days that on a given year that you could pull a permit. I know I work with a lot of y'all, all right? I know that this is a barrier. A lot of you don't want to burn during a hunting season, right? You know who you are. So if you're in the South and we have these protracted deer seasons and a turkey season and you don't want to burn during any of those, and then if we get into quail country, we have an even bigger window there. We've already reduced it down to about 29 days that we could pull a burn permit, all right? If you happen to own upland hardwoods and they're not wide open with a really dense grassy understory to carry fire as a fuel, you're going to have a real hard time burning between May and August. In fact, you're probably not going to be able to pull a permit on the day that it will actually burn for most years. So that window, if you have that restriction, is out too. Now we're down to about 20 days a year. If you happen to be someone who has a job and you can't burn 5 days a week, now we're down to the weekends. We're down to 7 days in the burn window when you can pull a permit, right? We're whittling it down. How many of you have nothing else to do on the weekend, right? Most of you have other things to do on the weekend. You have things come up. You've got a kid's birthday party or wedding or whatever, right? We're hoping it doesn't or occur on one of these 7 days, or that we can drop everything to burn. I'm guessing that probably doesn't happen for a lot of people. Now, what if you just, for whatever reason, you've never considered the fall burn window and you're not burning any then? Now we're down to 4 days. And if you happen to be a football fan and one of those days falls on the Super Bowl Sunday, now we're down to 3 days a year when you can pull a permit to burn. Now, how many of you can get all of the burning you think you need to get done in the 3 days, and you're certain that those 3 days aren't going to happen to fall on your kid's birthday or something like that? As you know, if we start thinking about that at the landscape scale, it's no wonder that we're struggling to burn at the level that we really need to for a lot of species. And I'm not just talking about deer. I know this is about deer, but we have a bunch of species that aren't doing very well that really need fire, and deer really benefit from fire a lot. So I want you to think about where you fall along that gradient and why it's so important for us to think about ways that we can expand this burn window, because we've literally painted ourselves into a corner at this point if you have all these constraints. So it's definitely something to think about. So I want to go back to the Fort Bragg example and talk about some reasons you might want to expand the burn window. So let's go to some forage data from an experiment that I did at Fort Bragg with Coulter Chitwood and Chris Morman and Chris DePerno. We did this together. And we did an experiment where we burned it. We had stands that were not burned the year of, and we compared that to burning during February or April or June. That's what the colors correspond to. I'm guessing that most of you have probably seen this gigantic outlier right here already. And what you're looking at is basically the year since fire, we don't have any really high quality vegetation available for the most part. Most of the stuff available is kind of rank. The deer aren't selecting to eat it. You can burn in February or April of the same year. Notice we don't have that big striking bar jump. But if you burned later in the season, like right at the beginning of fawning season, all of the sudden we have this ginormous spike in the proportion of available forage that is high quality selected forage, okay? So we're talking about a substantial change in the community in terms of what deer will select to eat from it. Now there's not that much biomass available, but all of the biomass available is deer food, all right? So it's an important thing for you to think about. So let's talk about that a little further. Based on a lot of the things we just said, this is what it shakes out to. If you actually look at burn data and when people burn, it's these dark gray bars right here, all right? We like to burn a lot in February and March, and we kind of do a little bit in April, depending on the context and where you are and what your objectives are, but we don't do it much outside of that. These are actually lightning generated fires. And this is for the past 30 years of data in the eastern United States. These white bars are when nature likes to burn things. And a lot of our species are well adapted to that different fire timing. So let's talk about Fort Bragg again. If we look at the average plant quality at Fort Bragg, and this is just grabbing the tender succulent leaves, this is not the rank vegetation, this is what deer would select. If we looked at phosphorus, which is the limiting nutrient in this environment, it doesn't meet the lactation requirements. The average plant doesn't for a doe that is lactating for one fawn, all right? We're probably not meeting peak antler growth either, but I'm gonna stick with the fawn because it's easy for reference. That doesn't mean she can't feed that fawn. In fact, in this population, they have triplets just as often as any other population, which is kind of a fun fact. We followed fawning in this herd, and triplets were just as common as in other studies, which is pretty cool, considering that it shouldn't be possible based on the other stuff you probably read. If we burn during February or April, notice we have this bump in May in quality, but during the time, this window when it's really critical for her to meet lactation or that peak antler growth, that's not happening. But if we burn during June, now the average plant, I'm talking about stuff like maples and you know, these hardwoods and things we don't even think of as deer food. Now the average plant meets their phosphorus requirements. She no longer needs to be selective. All of the food has become deer food, which is a pretty cool thing, right? So that's a pretty important consideration. And this is probably a big reason why Fort Bragg is able to produce those deer. Go to their Facebook page. They have their camera surveys every year open to the public to look at, and they kind of showcase some of these animals. It's pretty astonishing. Honestly, we're talking about years in a row where they have blown me away over and over again. Go take a look at that. So also you can get a permit to hunt there. So there's that. As you might imagine, from a deer behavioral response, this is another reason you might want to consider. Now, I realize based on where you're at, when deer are lactating and antler growth is happening and when hunting season is, and all these things are changing, right? And you know, based on your own context, when those things are, but there's a principle that's happening here. When you burn, about the next 2 months or so, they're going to have what's called a magnet effect. And it's because of what I just showed you with that forage production. This is real deer data using fire plots we replicated across Mississippi. I did this with a graduate student in my lab, Rainer Nichols, and Steve Damaris and Bronson Strickland were involved with the MSU Deer Lab in this research. And basically we had a whole bunch of stands that we burned in March. These were open pine stands. peak use of those stands occurred in May and June. And then if you burned in June, the peak use happened in July and August. Again, peak antler growth and lactation in this place is right in this area in July and August. All right, so we could change the timing of fire just slightly and shift that scale so that deer are using it when we want them to use it based on their requirements. Another thing, I really like for deer to use my stands during hunting season. Guess what happens if you move the burn timing out here into the fall? We have a magnet effect, except now it occurs early in the deer season. If it's still growing season, we still get that happening. And actually some of the cool stuff that I've been doing, we might even delay the senescence of plants, and we end up with a little longer of a bump in the native forage, it seems like, into the year, as long as you don't have a hard frost to kill them, which is pretty cool and definitely something pretty important in the South. But I really like for deer to use my stands during hunting season. That means they're not using the neighbor stands, right? So this applies just like that. We've done some burning, you know, later in the year, and we see this shifting scale in use like this. Notice even after the June fire, we're still maintaining higher use well into the fall. Another thing, in my experience, me included, we tend to think of this relationship between deer and fire and plants as being really linear. And the way I mean by that is we set stuff on fire, it affects plants, plants respond to that, deer respond to plants, we feed deer, deer are happy, the end, right? What you may not think about in that whole process is that plants don't like to be eaten by deer. So you've probably heard this elsewhere, and I know that I've said it several times, and I've got some work going on with a couple of colleagues where we're really trying to address this. But when you burn in the fall, you tend to have really good control on hardwoods, or just later in the season, later in the growing season, you have good control of hardwoods. And you tend to have a really good forb response. So broadleaf, herbaceous plant, the desirable plants that you want, you tend to have a really good response from that. Have you ever thought about why? Most of you probably have only thought about the only thing I really have heard anybody talk about, and that is hardwood. They have a harder time dealing with fire at that time because of where they're storing resources and how much growing season they have to respond, all of those things. And I'm guessing you're probably thinking about that relationship that way. But let me add a couple of other things into this. Right here, you're looking at diet selection. And what we were working on, this is again with the MSU Deer Lab, I was collaborating with those guys. And we had Rainer Nichols out there collecting all this data in Mississippi in the summer. And I know that was horrible. And I really appreciate that, Rainer, if you're listening. But he was out there collecting deer forage abundance and how it was responding to fire and how deer selection was changing. And what you're looking at right here is this is oaks, maples, hickories, greenbrier, and blackberry. So notice this line right here means they like it, or they're selecting it more than it's available. Those are the plants that they always really like. The blue means it was not burned. The orange means it was burned in March. The gray means it was burned in June. Notice we've taken maples and hickories, and mesophytes just means that it's a hardwood plant that doesn't like fire, which includes those two, and elms and things like that. We've turned those plants into as highly selected as our cream of the crop plants. Another thing that's pretty cool about that is when we're burning in that late season, deer seem to abandon the forbs. Right after fire, for that little burn window, when they're super attracted to it, they actually diet shift to focus on the browse that's resprouting, and it gives the forbs a competitive advantage because they're not dealing with that herbivory. And also plants that are top killed by fire and trying to recover from that, and then have a diet shift to more intensely browse on them, coupled with the fact that there's a more intense attraction to browse there. If you add those things together, we end up with a really high seedling mortality or resprout mortality in comparison to burning at other times because of that interaction between deer and the plants, which is pretty cool to think about and definitely important for you thinking about how you can adjust the burn window. Another thing, A lot of you have probably heard this, and I don't know how many times I've said it. Burning stimulates the seed bed. How many of you have heard that? Probably a lot of you. And it makes me wonder, where are the seeds? Think about that. So, well, they're in the seed bank, right? That's what we said, that we burn and then we stimulate the seed bank and then plants grow. And then you start thinking about that. It's like, well, does that mean there's just an unlimited amount of seeds laying around in the seed bank to respond? And then if that's the case, why do plants produce any seeds? There are already plenty of them out there. And then why do they go through all the effort to put a fruit around it, right? A lot of the things that you want a deer for your deer have a fruit that is edible by wildlife. And that is a strategy to disperse itself. So we started applying that concept. And I know we're supposed to be talking about deer, but you need to be thinking a little more broadly than that. I know this is the beer and deer, but this is a whole system and it's more complex than that. So I started thinking about, where are those seeds? And I have another graduate student who's working with me. It's at Tall Timbers, and this is David Mason. That big weird looking thing he's carrying out to the stand that's still burning is called a seed trap. And we made this thing basically with the idea that we could get birds to perch on it, just like they would on some of these dead stems and stuff in here, and then catch the seeds underneath it. And that's what he's doing right now. They land on this thing and do their business, and then he kind of looks through their business to see what they've deposited there. I know it's a really crappy job, right? So I really appreciate these graduate students. I mean, the work they're putting into this is really unbelievable. And that's the only reason I have this to develop to deliver to you all. So I really appreciate what they're doing. But after he looks in the burned area, we have them paired with these unburned areas, and exactly what you might expect happened. So this is some of the preliminary data, and he's building on this. But if this is actual data of seed dispersers using your burned units, if you burn during March, you get this peak in April and May and June. What is fruiting then? Blackberry is. 85 or 86% of the fruits that we catch in those seed traps are blackberry. And we catch about 10 times as many fruits in the burned area as the unburned. We're causing a magnet effect, and the birds and the deer and the turkeys and the quail and all the other things that are eating fruits and seeds out there are directing all of these seeds. They're literally carrying the habitat into the burned area. So think about that. What do you want to actually divert into the burned area? That's a really good place for seeds to colonize. And a lot of our forbs, especially things we really like for deer, occur during the late season. And we don't have good data on it yet, but I can tell you based on preliminary data, we're going to see the same thing happen with pokeweed and ragweed and partridge pea and all these other things that we want to colonize. When we burn later in the season, we get, this is actual real data, we get an increase in use from seed dispersers, and we're capturing more of those seeds. So we also have this added into what's going on in this system. We're literally directing tenfold the number of deer plants into burned areas based on what's available in the environment when we burn, which is a pretty awesome concept. So I want to talk a little bit about scale and burning in hardwoods, and I don't want to dwell on this too long, but if you are concerned about expanding the burn window and or are uncomfortable burning at larger scales, I want you to think about what we've just gone through and think about what is the smallest food plot you have planted and whether or not you think that attracts deer, right? Is that 1/4 of an acre? Is it 1/2 acre? Is it an acre? What's the scale? Whatever that number is for you, you need to think about burning at that same scale. Particularly if it's a concern for you to, sorry, I had something happen there. If it's a concern to you to burn at larger scales, burning at that scale, you can still have a big impact on habitat quality and have a behavioral response from the animals, and it's much more accessible for you. So if that's a barrier, consider that, especially if it helps you expand the burn window. You can literally blow out fire breaks up on hardwood stands and burn at that scale. And I mean, let's be honest, who can't burn a 1/2 acre or an acre, right? That's not that difficult to get into if you've gotten the training and you get your permit in order and everything. So Something that NDA helped us with to get the word out. It was another study that I led. We called it bow range burning. We literally wanted to see how small could we go. So we did exactly what you just saw, and we blew out these rings around our deer stands and put up cameras, and we're literally doing deer research like it's a hunting activity. So I'm a big time hunter. I wanted to see this just a little bit for that, but I was also being facetious because I was like, how small can you go and still get that burning response that we were looking for? And even when you burn a 30-yard radius, we see a substantial increase in deer use. And I believe it was to the tune of about 13 or 14 times as many bow shots that you would get in October if you burned in September at that scale. Most people can accomplish that, right? That's not that scary. And if that helps you get comfortable with fire, then by all means, please do that. All right, I want to leave you with one last barrier that I think is pretty important. And honestly, Kip, when I came up to talk at the Prescribed Fire Council, I realized how much of a barrier this is, particularly in some of the more northern places, but it's burning in hardwoods. And I worked with another colleague, Jordan Nanny, who's a Craig Harper student as well. We went through the literature. We found a whole bunch of papers, but I'm going to focus on this one that was a really good example. And I like this one because it had 140 stands in it almost. They were 10 to 50 acres, which is pretty comparable to what most of you are probably considering burning. They had 1 to 6 fires, and then they monitored all of the trees and their productivity in those stands for 25 years. So it was a pretty good study. And it was from the Appalachian region and the central hardwoods. And on average, when you look across all those stands, they averaged about 3% loss in their timber value when they burned, all right? That includes all the stands that were being burned actively. The worst case was one of the stands, they got about 10% damage or 10% loss, and that equated to about $84 per acre in that fully stocked stand. Now, when you look at these other studies, none of them have anything comparable to that, and most of them report something on average that's less than 3%. All right, I just want to caveat that. This is worst case scenario, but I think it's worth it for us to go with the worst case to see, is it still worth it for you to consider burning in your hardwoods? Now, I'm not talking about burning in your stands that you're trying to produce high quality veneer in or whatever. We're not talking about that. That's not where you're trying to burn. We're talking about in the other stands where you can produce some high quality deer habitat. So a study that I did in Tennessee with Craig, we opened up the canopy. You can see it here in this picture. We were able to increase production of forage by about 650 pounds per acre. That's high quality forage that on average is about 16% crude protein. We estimated the contract that burning was about $30 an acre. If we add that to the $84 an acre that we lost, and then look at that in a 10-year management plan, managing forage, on average, we're talking about 9 cents per pound of forage per pound of protein produced, not per pound of forage, per pound of protein. Okay, so we've multiplied it times 16%. If you compare that to your best, that's worst case scenario for burning. If you compare that to your best case scenario for a cowpea plot that flourishes and you've done everything right and it's popping, that's about 13 cents per pound of protein produced. If you compare that to pouring it out of a sack, we're talking about $2.50 per pound of protein. Okay, so think about that for a minute. And with that, we just took the average bag on the market as about $25 a sack and 20% crude protein. So what I just told you is, even considering that you're going to probably lose a little bit of value on your timber, you're still about 27 times more cost efficient to burn in their hardwood stands than you would be to pour that protein out of a sack, not to mention all the other habitat benefits. So 27 times. If we consider that we wouldn't do that under a closed canopy anyway, and we wouldn't have a fully stocked stand, and we remove half of the timber because we want an open stand to burn in, we're over 50 times more effective to burn in upland hardwoods to produce deer forage than we would be to pour it out of a sack. And we are still over 10 times as effective as planting it in a food plot. So that's something to take home, for you to think about. You definitely have a risk in burning in upland hardwoods, but if you consider what you're losing by not having that high quality habitat in that stand over that time, and the fact, if you look at it on a cost per pound produced, it's still a pretty effective method, even when you're in your worst case scenario. So that's pretty cool. I wanted to end there because I know I'm kind of getting short on time, but there've been a whole bunch of people and organizations that have been involved in this, and I really appreciate everything. A lot of graduate students who collected all this data, and they deserve props for it because a lot of it is really hard work, and a lot of great people along the way that have helped. Also, I want to throw in a plug. We have a podcast network. I host Fire University. We also have the Natural Resource University Network. A lot of great information there. If you haven't listened to that, take a listen. But I'm also on social media. You can follow our Deer Lab at UF Deer Lab, or me at Dr. Disturbance. Happy to answer questions or anything you may have. And of course, I'm happy to start this chat.
Good deal, Marcus. Very, very well done. How about, let's do this. How about you stop sharing your screen, and that way we can get back to where folks can see you full screen. There we go. So kudos to you. Good. There was actually one piece early, and I'm going to say this before we get to the first question. One slide earlier that you mentioned that I was expecting to hear you say something else about it. You had talked about the final forage thing there, and then you showed that picture of that pokeweed. And I remember watching that final forage. There was one participant on there, I think a pretty sharp guy, that actually was talking about pokeweed in a real positive manner, predicting that probably was one of the most popular things. So glad to see that you included that in here because that is pretty high quality deer forage.
Yeah, no question. I threw that in there for you, Kip. And the other thing, I think it proves the point. You know, we use soil productivity as a barrier to implementing good, sound habitat management practices. I hear that all the time. My dirt's too poor, but the plant, if you're producing those kinds of plants on it, they're just as high quality as they would be in the higher quality dirt. The limitation is how much of it you can produce. It's not the quality of it. And some of our research, Don Chance is one that I'm thinking of. He went through the literature with me, and we looked at some of these management practices and how much bang for your buck you would get. You actually get a lot more bang for your buck in poor dirt than you do in good dirt because it's already in pretty good shape normally, relatively, in the good dirt. So interesting thing. But yeah, I threw
all of our attendees here tonight, let them know I was on the Forbes bracket with Marcus, and actually I am the one that picked pokeweed as their preferred. Marcus won that bracket with Beggar's Lice as a more preferred forward. So and then actually Marcus went on to be the grand champion. So if you have not seen it, spoiler alert to everybody else, Dr. Harper was there, Dr. Strickland was there, Matt was on that. A lot of pretty smart folks relative to all of this forage stuff. And Marcus was the grand champion in the final forage, the March Madness. So anyway, good job. Well, Matt, let me turn it over to you. I'll let you ask the first question.
All right. Thanks for considering me a pretty smart guy, Kip. I appreciate that. All right. We got a bunch of questions in here, Marcus. We're going to just start at the top. Thomas asks, how many years after you plant new pines in the Southeast can you plant and burn? Right after planting.
So how many years after planting which species of pine?
He didn't say, he just says pines Southeast. So go with the normal suite of species that are planted.
Yeah. Let me throw out the old biologist adage. It depends.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and it's definitely a limitation to people. And it really does depend on how much you value that timber. And you know, when you are particularly young with loblolly and slash pine, for instance, you can kill a lot of seedlings if you're burning really early, like in the first couple of years. If you're not worried about that, then you can burn as soon as you have ground cover intact. In some cases, that's within a year or two. It depends also on what kind of site prep was done. If you have an intensive site prep with imazapyr, for instance, that might be delayed on when you can actually get the fire to carry through. Once the stand gets up a little bit older in age, you can run a backing fire or a night burn. We don't talk about night burning that much, but that's a good way to control fire intensity. You can get away with it without impacting your trees too much, even then.
Thanks, Marcus. Kip, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, and this is actually along those same lines, Marcus. Kind of like a what age of the stand are you going to do your first burn? I'll set the stage for it. We're talking South Louisiana and Mississippi, and then advanced generation loblolly pine stand. At what age should you do your first burn in that? And should you do that in conjunction with the first thinning, or should you do it separate from that first thinning?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I'm really thinking about the stocking density that you had and what the site prep was initially and what your objectives are. So if you're one of those people, and I would work with some of these people who really don't care about the pine timber and you're just trying to maximize deer production, you can get in there pretty quickly, especially if the planting density was relatively sparse. So a lot of people are interested in wildlife will spread the seedlings out more. You're not, if you're not burning up front, you don't want to do that, and you don't want to risk killing some of your pine seedlings, you would probably do that in conjunction with your first thin, which with loblolly in that part of the world is often at 15 to 18, depending on the stocking density and the site index. So the problem with that is, especially if you had site prep, you only have 2 or 3 years where you're really producing some high quality deer forage and cover. And then you kind of have this decade or more of a wasteland where it's not very good for anything. And you're kind of stuck right there, right? You're pre-commercial, so you'd have to pay money to get timber off of it. It's getting to the point where the fires can get pretty intense if you're trying to kill trees with that to thin it out. So, you kind of get in a little more of a tricky situation, and it really does depend on what you're, which species you are, how much you care about that timber, what the spacing was, what the site prep was. Those sorts of things definitely play a role in that. But I'm an advocate of getting the fire in early, especially if you have a wider spacing. Even though you're going to kill some of the trees, if you're not worried about that, you can maintain high quality deer habitat for extended well into the future after you've established those. And I've seen a lot of people do that well. With long leaf, that's a little bit different. We can get on in there, and in fact, to get it out of the initial grass stage, it benefits it to get it in pretty early.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a twofer. I got 2 questions in a row that had to do with hardwood burning, and it must have been right when you were talking about the hardwood section of the presentation. First one is, what was the basal area on that hardwood burn from Lashley et al. 2011? So I guess the answer there would be, what's the recommended basal area you would like it to be before you burn? And then the second part of that question is, any recommendations on ideal weather in terms of temperature, relative humidity, and then other fire data such as dead fuel moisture and other things on there. So basically, what's the best conditions to burn in hardwoods, basal area, and weather? Okay.
Great questions. For those timber harvests, we were targeting somewhere between a 40 and 60% canopy cover. So I think that was in the neighborhood of 60 basal areas, what that would work out to. So somewhere in that neighborhood, that we implemented those cuts based on the recommendations at the time for a shelterwood harvest, which is designed to regenerate oak. And if you are really interested in wildlife and not so interested in timber value, you could certainly reduce it more and get a longer term response out of it. I have, for instance, a stand on my own property where we went in and reduced it down to just, it's probably 5 to 10 basal area. It's really like a savanna structure, and we left all the really high quality, high producing oaks in it in little patches. And that's some of the best deer habitat that I've ever seen, really. So that's another good approach. So again, it can really depend. In terms of the conditions, again, that depends a lot. If you're in a closed canopy stand, you almost, without it being during the dormant season, when you get a lot of radiative heat through the canopy to the forest floor, it's really hard, especially in our stand composition that we have now with so many of these non-pyrophytic species, these maples and elms and things sort of taking over that mid-story. It's really hard to get a fire to carry outside of the dormant season. You probably can in sometimes during the fall time frame, but really getting some sunlight into the stand and getting fuels and that are conducive to burning during the growing season is pretty important if you're trying to do that. That dictates what kind of fuel moisture you need and the wind speeds. But in general, I think we're burning with 8 or 10 mile an hour winds, something like that. And we're often doing it during the dormant season. We've often got it in the upper 20s in relative humidity. Sometimes you can get it done even in the low 30s, depending on the stand composition. So something in that neighborhood. And one of the things that I wanted to add that I didn't have time to with burning in hardwoods, we're not talking about those pine burns that you saw. Somebody said something about the fire intensity. You're not doing that in hardwoods. That's not what we're trying to do at all. You're trying to maintain a fire intensity that's less than knee high. And, one of the things that's really important that you need to consider, and it can be done really effectively, is if you have some prized trees that you're trying to protect, don't let them have slash around them when you burn it. Go take the time, go in there with a chainsaw or kick limbs out away from those trees that you want to make sure are protected in that. And if you're using low intensity prescribed fire, at less than knee high flame lengths and using some of those less intense burning techniques, you can really reduce the risk of damaging trees. And I've seen it done in cases where I'd be hard pressed to find a tree that has damage on it.
All right. Hey, Marcus, we have about 5 minutes left. Let's see if we can get through a few more questions here, and we'll do kind of a rapid fire thing where
Sure.
We'll let you give a quick answer and we'll move along. First one is somebody's leasing land from a timber company. From your experience, do the timber companies typically allow the lessees to burn any, or is that pretty much just being conducted by the timber company themselves?
Great question. In most cases, they're not allowing their lessees to burn. And in my experience, in many cases, they're not burning either. So, yeah, that's the quick answer.
That's good.
Gotcha.
Here's the next one. Robert says, good info on burning. What about burning grass or switchgrass? Does burning those types of things have the same benefits? Doesn't specifically say for deer, but I'm going to say for deer. Does it have the same benefits?
Yeah, if you have a monoculture stand, it is not going to have the same benefit. But in most cases, you're going to have some stuff pop up in there that's not necessarily what you planted. And those typically will be things that are good, especially if it's during that later season burn timing.
Thanks. Kip,
All
you're
right.
up.
How about quail? We have a guy, he did his first burn this past February, so dormant season. Marcus, upland pine. He's asking, he didn't do this for deer, he did this for quail. He wants to know what your recommendations are for quail going into this fall after that first burn.
In the stand that was already burned?
It sounds like, yeah. I'm not sure if he's looking at what is the next step with that or what, but burned that upland pine this February. I guess maybe what can we expect this fall? Maybe either from a quail or a deer perspective.
Right. If you have a low basal area of timber in there and you burned during this dormant season, you can probably expect a pretty high use of quail if they're around of that stand this fall. In terms of what my recommendation would be to you to continue that on is in most places in the South, you need a more frequent burn return interval, and quail will really benefit from that. And typically quail are kind of at the smaller scale of when they really benefit in terms of stand size. So that's where I'd really be thinking about how do we carve off some smaller pieces, the 10 or 20 acre pieces rather than it being 50 or 100 acre if you can help it.
All right. How about two more, Kip? I'll do one, then you do one more. Can you speak a little bit more on the impact of turkey nesting if we burn in the late spring? You touched on it, but give the 30,000 foot answer.
Absolutely. This is something that I get I'm a target for, I think. Now, I'm an advocate of expanding the burn window, but if you don't need to, that's fine. If you can get all your burning done, that's fine. In terms of turkey nesting, I think about it like this. Turkeys nest on the ground during the time that nature burned in systems that burned, and they are well adapted to that. And they show us that in a couple of ways. One, if you do burn a nest, about 75% of hens will re-nest. We don't want that to happen. I'm not trying to burn up a nest, but they do have another chance, okay? The other thing to consider with that is if we look at the range of turkeys, poult survival is actually the more common problem. And if you know what hens do with poults when they're born, they go to the nearest burned area if they have access to it. So I'm thinking about that. And if they lose their poults, they do not have another shot at it. They're gone. That's over for that year. All right. So that's what I'm thinking about. And that really is a scale dependent issue. Don't burn 2,000 acre blocks during that time. That's not what I'm saying at all, but chopping off 20 acres here and there so that you can get your burning done, I don't see that as a problem at all, especially since the poults seem to do really well there, and you might even increase the number of turkeys you recruit, even if you burn some nest up.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Kip?
All right,
Last
one
one.
more. And I'm gonna jump down a couple questions here because I am asked this a lot, and Marcus, you're the perfect one to answer this. Guy is asking specifically about a place in Pennsylvania, but this does not have to be Pennsylvania specific. This is across the board. Anybody in any state here tonight, this will benefit them. Can you use fire timing or fire interval to shift forb composition into species you'd prefer? So can you use that fire to get those that you want or not?
That's a great question. In general, you're going to increase the abundance of forbs that you want for deer with that later season burning. Now, how much you can adjust it, that's what we're working on right now, trying to figure out the caveats with that. And based on some of the data that we have so far, we can adjust at a pretty fine scale which species we're catching the most in it. And I don't know if that will translate into those being more abundant, but it makes sense. If a seed lands in a recently prepped seed bed, then it probably does better there. And so my guess is that, yes, we probably have a little more control than we realize over it.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, Marcus. Before everybody starts dropping off, don't forget, I'm going to give away a prize. But before we do that, Nick asked y'all before, and I'm going to reiterate it. If you're not a member of the National Deer Association, please join. I think most of you are. I see a lot of familiar faces or names, I say, on the list, but I've been a member well before I was an employee. I urge you to join. Kip, what's coming up next month?
We have our webinar May 10th, so mark your calendars. This is another habitat-focused one. It's Adam Keith and Matt Dye from Land and Legacy. They're going to be talking about old field management, the value for bucks, does, and fawns. So you want to make sure you mark your calendar and come join us again in another month.
All right. So the prize, I'm going to ask a question. I don't even have it. This is how hot off the press it is. We have a whole bunch of NDA merch that is now hitting shelves, and we actually advertise it in our next magazine. They're sending staff some of this stuff, so I don't have it even to show you, but the next the first person that answers this correctly will get a National Deer Association trucker cap. We're going to send it right to you. So you can show it proudly and maybe even get it before Kip or I do. So I'm going to throw a softball. Hopefully it's a softball. A couple months ago, I threw a hard one. Well, you going to say something to Kip?
Now, I was going to say, just to clarify, do you want them to answer this in the chat or in the Q&A?
Yeah, we're going to type it in the chat. So not in the Q&A, in the chat. Right. So I have that open right here. So make sure you're looking in the chat section. What was the number of days of burning window in the first or second slide that Marcus put up there, total over the year? First one was, boy, that went up quick. Let's see.
Y'all were listening.
Yeah, I got to scroll way down. Hold on a second. Dan Schuch, if I'm pronouncing that right, SCHUCH, or it might be Shuck. If you're Dan, email me at matt@deerassociation.com. And that way I'll have your email address and we can talk. But Dan, SCHUCH, you are the winner. It was 90 days of total burning window based on the study. And then Marcus went through the process of started saying, well, if you go and watch the football game and you're not going to burn when you're hunting, and he reduced it down to 3. So what else we got, Kip?
Good deal. I hope everybody enjoyed this tonight as much as I did. Marcus, thank you so much. I learned something every single time that I get to watch you speak or get to talk to you on the phone. So I'm the lucky one here. I got to talk to you to help set this up. I learned something on those conversations. I learned something again today when we talked, and I learned a pile tonight. So thank you for sharing your information, and you do it in a way that makes it very relatable to people, understandable, how they can take it right back and apply it. So thank you for all the attendees. Thanks for joining. Follow Marcus. He makes all of this stuff really easy to get to. So at Fire University and Dr. Disturbance, keep up with him, keep up with us, and good luck for those of you that are out turkey hunting. Our season in Pennsylvania doesn't start yet, but we're getting close. So Matt, that's all I got tonight. I'll let you close it out.
All right, everybody. Thanks. We'll hopefully see you next month. Tell your friends, and good luck. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.